Welcome back to Thinking Readers, where children listen to stories and learn to think. Today is day 9 of our story advent calendar. Yesterday, we read the first 2 chapters of Charlotte's Web. We practiced summarising and looked at how the writer showed us what the characters were like through their actions and speech. We also figured out the meaning of the word injustice by looking at the words that came before it and looking at the prefix in before the word justice. The question I left you with was, have you ever persuaded your parents to get you a pet? Or would you like to persuade your parents to get you a pet? And how did you do it? Or how will you do it? Did you come up with something good? Did you actually persuade your parents? Do you now have a pet? I shared with Donkey the fact that I did not persuade my parents to get me a pet when I was a child. So I had to adopt one of the cows in the fields, and I did do that. However, my family did persuade me to get a dog, and they did it by telling me how much walking I would get, how much exercise and fresh air, knowing how much I love to walk. And I relented. So they were persuasive because they used something that they knew that I loved to persuade me. Good luck with that. Our book today is Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce. Let's have a look at the front cover and see if we can make a prediction about what this story is going to be about. This is a pretty atmospheric picture, don't you think? Let's get reading. Chapter 1, Exile. If, standing alone on the back doorstep, Tom allowed himself to weep tears, they were tears of anger. He looked his goodbye at the garden and raged that he had to leave it. Leave it and Peter. They'd planned to spend their time here so joyously these holidays. Town gardens are small as a rule, and the Longs' garden was no exception to that rule. There was a vegetable plot and a grass plot and one flower bed and a rough patch by the back fence. In this last, the apple tree grew. It was large, but bore very little fruit, and accordingly the 2 boys had always been allowed to climb freely over it. These holidays they would have built a tree house in its branches. Tom gazed and then turned back into the house. As he passed the foot of the stairs, he called up, "Goodbye, Peter!" There was a croaking answer. He went out onto the front doorstep where his mother was waiting with his suitcase. He put his hand out for it, but Mrs. Long clung to the suitcase a moment longer, claiming his attention first. "You know, Tom, it's not nice you being sent away for the holidays to avoid the measles, but it's not nice for us either. Your father and I will miss you, and so will Peter. Peter's not having a nice time anyway with the measles." "I didn't say you'd all be having a nice time without me," said Tom. "I just said—" "Hush," said his mother, looking past him to the road and the car that waited there and the man at the driving wheel. She gave Tom the case and then bent over him, pushing his tie up to cover his collar button and letting her lips come to within a few inches of his ear. "Tom, dear Tom," she murmured, trying to prepare him for the weeks ahead. "Remember that you will be a visitor, and do try, what can I say? Try to be good." She kissed him and gave him a dismissive push towards the car and then followed him to it. As Tom got in, Mrs. Long looked past him to the driver. "Give my love to Gwen," she said, "and tell her, Alan, how grateful we are to you both for taking Tom at such short notice. It's very kind of you. Isn't it, Tom?" "Very kind," Tom repeated bitterly. "There's so little room in the house," said Mrs. Long, "when there's illness." "We're glad to help out," Alan said. He started the engine. Tom wound down the window next to his mother. "Goodbye, then." "Oh, Tom," her lips trembled, "I am sorry, spoiling the beginning of your summer holiday like this." The car was moving. He had to shout back, "I'd rather have had measles with Peter! Much rather!" Tom waved goodbye angrily to his mother and then, careless even of the cost to others, waved to an inflamed face pressed up against a bedroom window. Mrs. Long looked upwards to see what was there, raised her hands in a gesture of despair — Peter was supposed to keep strictly in bed — and hurried indoors. Tom closed the car window and sat back in his seat in hostile silence. His uncle cleared his throat and said, "Well, I hope we get on reasonably well." This was not a question, so Tom did not answer it. He knew he was being rude, but he made excuses for himself. He didn't much like Uncle Alan, and he didn't want to like him at all. Indeed, he would have preferred him to be a brutal uncle. If only he'd beat me, thought Tom, then I could run away home, and Mother and Father would say I'd done right, in spite of the quarantine for measles. But he'll never even try to beat me. And Aunt Gwen, she's worse because she's a child lover, and she's kind. Cooped up for weeks with Alan and Gwen in a poky flat. He'd never visited them before, but he knew they lived in a flat with no garden. They drove in silence. Their route back took them through Ely, but they only stopped for Alan Kitson to buy a picture postcard of the cathedral tower. It was for Tom. Tom was bitterly disappointed that he wasn't allowed to climb the tower, but his uncle pointed out to him with great reasonableness that this was quite out of the question. He was in quarantine for measles. He mustn't mix with Peter in case he caught measles, and he mustn't mix with other people in case he already had Peter's measles. Fortunately, the Kitsons had both had measles anyway. They drove on through Ely and the Fens, and then through Castleford and beyond to where the Kitsons lived in a big house, now converted into flats. The house was crowded round with newer, smaller houses that beat up to its very confines in a broken sea of bay windows and gable ends and pinnacles. It was the only big house among them, oblong, plain, grave. Alan Kitson sounded the car horn and turned into the drive, only it was really too short to be called a drive now. He pulled up outside a pillared front door, and Aunt Gwen appeared in the doorway, laughing and wanting to kiss Tom. She drew him inside, and Uncle Alan followed with the luggage. There were cold stone flags under Tom's feet, and in his nostrils a smell of old dust that had been no one's business to disperse. As he looked around, he felt a chill. The hall of the big house was not mean, nor was it ugly, but it was unwelcoming. Here it lay at the heart of the house, for it went centrally from front to back, with a sideways part at the stair-foot in a T-shape. And the heart of the house was empty, cold, dead. Someone had pinned bright travel posters on the high grey walls. Someone had left a laundry basket with a laundry list. There were empty milk bottles against a far door with a message to the milkman. But none of these things seemed to really belong to the hall. It remained empty and silent. Silent unless one counted the voice of Aunt Gwen chattering on about Tom's mother and Peter's measles. When her voice died for a moment, Tom heard the only sound that went on. Tick, and then tick, and then tick, of a grandfather clock. "No, don't touch it, Tom," said Aunt Gwen as he turned towards it. She lowered her voice. "It belongs to Mrs. Old Bartholomew upstairs, and she's rather particular about it." Tom had never looked inside a grandfather clock, and he thought it might be something he could do later, privately. Surely he could just look. Now, with his back to the clock, innocently continuing to converse with his aunt, he slipped his fingernails under the edge of the door to try it. "If Mrs. Bartholomew's so particular about her clock, why doesn't she have it upstairs with her?" Tom asked. He levered gently with his nails. The door was resisting him. "Because the clock is screwed to the wall at the back, and the screws have rusted in," said Aunt Gwen. "Come away from it, Tom, do. Come up for tea." "Oh," said Tom, as if he hadn't realised where he was standing. He moved away. The pendulum door had been locked. They were going upstairs to the Kitsons' flat when, from behind them, the grandfather clock struck 1, with stately emphasis. Uncle Alan frowned and made some cutting comment. The clock kept good time. Its fingers were now correctly pointing to 5 o'clock, but it seldom chose to strike the right hour. It was utterly unreliable in its striking, Uncle Alan said. Moreover, the voice of the clock was so penetrating he could even hear it being unreliable from his upstairs bed at night. They reached the first door where the Kitsons lived. Beyond, another narrow staircase mounted to the attic flat of Mrs. Bartholomew, who owned the grandfather clock and the whole house. She was the landlady, and the Kitsons, like the other inhabitants of the big house, were her tenants. "This is our flat, Tom dear," said Aunt Gwen, "and here's the guest room, your bedroom. I've put flowers in it and books for you to read." She smiled at him, begging him with her eyes to like it here. Tom's bedroom was lofty, but otherwise of medium size. There was another door in it, like the door of entry. The window, large and paned, was one of those he'd seen from outside. Tom had been preparing himself to be a grateful guest, but there are bars across the bottom of the window, he burst out. "This is a nursery. I'm not a baby." Of course not, Aunt Gwen cried, equally upset. "It's nothing to do with you, Tom. There were bars across it when we came. The bathroom window had bars too, for that matter." Tom's suspicions were not entirely stilled. When he was left to unpack before tea, Tom examined the room more closely. The other door led only into a cupboard for clothes. The books were school stories for girls from Aunt Gwen's childhood, and there above all, however much Aunt Gwen tried to explain them away, were the nursery bars to the window. However, tea cheered Tom a little. Aunt Gwen had made a Devonshire tea, with boiled eggs, homemade scones and homemade strawberry jam, and whipped cream. She was a good cook, she said, and she enjoyed cooking. She intended to spoil Tom for food while he was with them. After tea, Tom wrote a letter of safe arrival to his mother. He enclosed a picture postcard for Peter with a very fair statement of the situation. "Hope your measles are better," he wrote. "This is the picture of the cathedral tower at Ely." Tom knew Peter would be interested. The two of them made a point of climbing church towers as well as trees. "We came through Ely, but UA wouldn't let me up the tower. The house is flat and there isn't any garden. My bedroom window has bars, but AG says it's a mistake. The food's good." After reading this through, Tom decided, in fairness to Aunt Gwen, to underline the last sentence. He signed the postcard with his private device, an elongated cat, supposed to be a Tom. It signified Tom Long. He was marking in the whiskers of the cat when he heard the sound of the grandfather clock from below in the hall. Yes, you could hear it striking distinctly. You could count the strokes. Tom counted them and smiled condescendingly. The clock was wrong again in its striking, senselessly wrong. Chapter 2. The clock strikes 13. The striking of the grandfather clock became a familiar sound to Tom, especially in the silence of those nights when everyone else was asleep. He did not sleep. He would go to bed at the usual time and lie awake or lie half awake for hour after hour. He never suffered from sleeplessness before in his life, and wondered at it now. But a certain tightness and unease in his stomach should have given him the answer. Sometimes he would doze, and then in his half-dreaming he became two persons, and one of them would not go to sleep, but selfishly insisted on keeping the other one awake with a little murmuring monologue on whipped cream and shrimp sauce and rum butter and real mayonnaise and all the other rich variety of his diet nowadays. From that, Tom was positively relieved to wake up again. Aunt Gwen's cooking was the cause of Tom's sleeplessness, that and the lack of exercise. Tom had to stay indoors and do crossword puzzles and jigsaw puzzles and never even answer the door when the milkman came, in case he gave the poor man measles. The only exercise he took was in the kitchen when he was helping his aunt to cook these large, rich meals, larger and richer than any Tom had ever known before. Tom had few ideas on the causes and cures of sleeplessness, and it never occurred to him to complain. At first he tried to read himself to sleep with Aunt Gwen's schoolgirl stories. They didn't even bore him enough to do that, but he persevered with them. Then Uncle Alan had found him still reading at 11:30 at night. There had been an outcry. After that, Tom was rationed to 10 minutes reading in bed, and he had to promise not to switch on the bedroom light after it had been switched off, and his aunt had bidden him good night. He didn't regret the reading, but the dragging hours seemed even longer in the dark. One night, he'd been lying awake as usual, fretting against the dark and against the knowledge that his uncle and aunt would be sitting reading, talking, doing whatever they pleased by the excellent electric lights in the sitting room. Here he was, wide awake in the dark with nothing to do. He'd borne it for what seemed like many nights, but suddenly tonight he could bear it no more. He sat up, threw his bedclothes back with a masterful gesture, and stepped out of bed, though as yet with no clear purpose. He felt his way over to the bedroom door, opened it quietly, and passed out into the tiny hall of the flat. Tom could hear the ordered sound of Uncle Alan reading from behind the sitting room door. He would be reading aloud from his favourite clever weekly newspaper. Aunt Gwen would be devotedly listening, or asleep. A moment's thought, and Tom had glided into the larder. This would have been a routine move at home. He and Peter had often done it. In Aunt Gwen's larder there were 2 cold pork chops, half a trifle, some bananas, and some buns and cakes. Tom tried to persuade himself that he hesitated only because he didn't know which to choose, but he knew he wasn't hungry. As a matter of form, he laid hold of a very plain, stale bun. Then a great weariness of food overcame him, and he put the bun down, leaving it to another day of existence. He'd been moving all this time in perfect silence. He would have been ashamed for his skill in such an expedition to have done otherwise. But he had ill luck. As he went out from the kitchen and larder, he came face to face with his uncle coming out of the sitting room. His uncle's exclamation of surprise and disapproval brought his aunt out after him. Tom knew that he was in the wrong, of course, but they didn't have to make such a fuss. Aunt Gwen was most upset because if Tom slipped into the larder at night, that meant he was hungry. She was not feeding him properly. He was suffering from night starvation. Uncle Alan, on the other hand, had not been unobservant of Tom at mealtimes, and he could not credit his being hungry. Besides, Tom had admitted he'd taken nothing from the larder. Why had he been there then? Was it a blind? What was it? Tom never really convinced them of the simple truth, that a boy would naturally go into a larder, even if he were not hungry. Anyway, they pointed out, he was out of bed far too late. He was hustled back again, and his uncle stood over him to make a speech. Tom, there must be no more of this. You are not to put the light on again once it's been put out. Nor equally are you to get out of bed. You must see the reasonableness. Not even to get up in the morning, Tom interrupted. Oh, of course that's different. Don't be silly, Tom. But you're not to get up otherwise. The reason is, can't I get up, even if I need to really badly? Of course you must go to the lavatory if you need to, but you will go straight back to bed afterwards. You go to bed at 9 in the evening and you get up at 7 in the morning. That is 10 hours. You need those 10 hours because... But Uncle Alan, I don't sleep. Will you be quiet, Tom? Shouted his uncle, suddenly losing his temper. I'm trying to reason with you. Now, where was I? 10 hours sleep, said Tom subduedly. Yes, a child of your age needs 10 hours sleep. You must realise that, Tom. For that reason, you must be in bed for 10 hours. As I've said, am I making myself clear to you? Yes. Now, I want you to promise to observe our wishes. Will you promise, Tom? Why could a boy never refuse to promise these large demands? Oh, I suppose so, said Tom. Yes. There, said Aunt Gwen and Uncle Alan. Good. I knew I could reason with you. But all the same, I don't sleep. Uncle Alan said sharply, all children sleep. And Aunt Gwen added more gently, it's just your imagination, Tom. Poor Tom had no answer but contradiction, and he felt that would be unwise. They left him. He lay in the dark, planning a letter to his mother. Take me away at once. But no, that was perhaps cowardly and would worry his mother dreadfully. He would unburden himself to Peter instead, although Peter, because of his measles, couldn't reply. He would tell Peter how miserably dull it was here, even at night. Nothing to do, nowhere to go, nobody to speak of, to do things with. It's the worst hole I've ever been in, he wrote in imagination. I'd do anything to get out of it. To be somewhere else, anywhere. It seemed to him that his longing to be free swelled up in him and in the room until it should surely be enough to burst the walls and set him free indeed. They'd left him, and now they were going to bed. Uncle Alan took a bath, and Tom lay listening to him and hating him. For some reason, Tom could always hear what went on in the bathroom, as clearly as if he were there himself. Tonight he was almost in the bath with Uncle Alan. Later he heard other movements and conversations from elsewhere in the flat. Finally, the line of light under his door disappeared. That meant that the hall light of the flat had been switched off for the night. Slow silence. And then the grandfather clock struck 12. By midnight, his uncle and aunt were almost always in bed, and asleep too, usually. Only Tom lay still open-eyed and sullen, imprisoned in wakefulness. And at last, 1! The clock struck the present hour, but, as if to show its independence of mind, went on striking. 2! For once Tom was not amused by its striking the wrong hour. 3! 4! It's 1 o'clock, Tom whispered angrily over the edge of the bedclothes. Why don't you strike 1 o'clock then, as all the clocks would do at home? Instead, 5, 6. Even in his irritation, Tom could not stop counting. 7, 8. After all, the clock was the only thing that would speak to him at all in these hours of darkness. 9, 10. You are going it, thought Tom, but yawning in the midst of his unwilling admiration. Yes, and it hadn't finished yet. 11, 12. Fancy striking midnight twice in one night, jeered Tom sleepily. 13, proclaimed the clock, and then stopped striking. 13. Tom's mind gave a jerk. Had it really struck 13? Even mad old clocks never struck that. He must have imagined it. Had he not been falling asleep or already sleeping? But no, awake or dozing, he'd counted up to 13. He was sure of it. He was uneasy in this knowledge that this happening made some difference to him. He could feel it in his bones. The stillness had become an expectant one. The house seemed to hold its breath. The darkness pressed up to him, pressing him with a question. Come on, Tom. The clock struck 13. What are you going to do about it? Nothing, said Tom aloud. And then, as an afterthought, don't be silly. What could he do anyway? He had to stay in bed, sleeping, trying to sleep, for 10 whole hours, as near as might be, from 9 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning. That was what he'd promised when his uncle had reasoned with him. Uncle Alan had been so sure of his reasoning, and yet Tom began to feel that there had been some flaw in it. Uncle Alan, without discussing the idea, had taken for granted that there were 24 hours in a day, twice 12 hours. But suppose instead there were twice 13. Then, from 9 at night to 7 in the morning, with the 13th hour somewhere in between, was more than 10 hours. It was 11. He could be in bed for 10 hours and still have an hour to spare. An hour of freedom. But steady, steady. This is ridiculous. There simply were not 13 hours and half a day. Everyone knew that. But why had the clock said there were then? You couldn't get round that. Yes, but everyone knew the grandfather clock struck the hours at the wrong times of day, 1 o'clock when it should be 5 o'clock, and so on. Admittedly, argued the other Tom, the one that would never let Sleepy Tom sleep, admittedly the clock struck the wrong hours at the wrong time, but all the same they were hours, real hours, hours that really existed. Now the clock had struck 13, affirming that, for this once at least, there was an extra 13th hour. But it can't be true, said Tom aloud. The house, which appeared to have been following this argument, sighed impatiently. At least I think it isn't true. And anyway, it's muddling. Meanwhile, you're missing your chance, whispered the house. I can't honourably take it, said Tom, because I don't believe the grandfather clock was telling the truth when it struck 13. Oh, said the house coldly. So it's a liar, is it? Tom sat up in bed, a little angry in his turn. Now, he said, I'm going to prove this one way or the other. I'm going to see what the clock fingers say. I'm going down to the hall. End of chapter 2. This was quite a hard story to read aloud. Was this quite a hard story to follow? It's a slightly different style to some of the other books that we've read. And some of those sentences are extremely long. We can look at them in a little bit more detail after we've done our summarising, okay? It's super important, if a book is a little bit more complicated, that we summarise to just check we've understood the main thrust of the story. Okay, let's use our 4-point method. Who's our main character? The book's named after him. It's Tom, isn't it? Where is he? He's staying with his aunt and uncle in their poky little flat that has no garden as he quarantines from the measles. What's the problem? Action or focus? The grandfather clock, which mischimes, as in the hall of the building, and usually keeps Tom company at night, chimes 13. Consequently, Tom is really affected by this. He thinks something's up and he needs to go and investigate. And against the instructions of his aunt and uncle, he's going down to the hall to check the hands on the clock. At the end of chapter 2, the passages at the end of chapter 2, how was your head feeling? Can I just read a sentence again to you? Admittedly, argued the other Tom, the one that would never let the sleepy Tom sleep. Admittedly, the clock struck the hours at the wrong time, but all the same they were hours, real hours, hours that really existed. This is an example of a sentence that is very long and it's got clauses within it. It's got lots of hyphens. It even had a semicolon. It's a fat sentence. And in these passages, when Tom is wrestling, the two Toms are wrestling with the significance of the 13 hours, we have these long, unwieldy sentences. So if you were ending up feeling a bit confused or your head was exploding by the end of these chapters, so was mine, because there was so much back and forth and so many digressions and interjections, extra sentences, extra clauses, extra words here and there that really our head was full. Also, I counted up in this last section, how many buts do you think there were? But suppose instead. But steady, steady. But why? Yes, but all the same. But it can't be true. There were 6 buts. And the but shows us the counter-argument that Tom is experiencing. He doesn't want this to be strange, but it is. And his alter ego is telling him, but this, but that, but this, but that, and this constant back and forth. It's exhausting, isn't it, for the reader? This is how Tom's feeling. So I think this is so clever, the way that the writer, with all this lengthy writing, these long sentences that are packed full, gets us, the reader, to be inside the head of Tom. Even though this is an external third-person narrator, the way that it's written, with all these polyclausal sentences, sentences within sentences, extra words stuffed in there, it takes us into the confusion of Tom's head. Isn't that clever? We can contrast this with Charlotte's Web. Do you remember when Fern is pleading to keep Wilbur the second time? And Mr. Arable says he has to go to Mr. Zuckerman's farm. Mr. Arable is speaking in these very short sentences. He's made up his mind. The pig's going. He knows that Fern is really persuasive, and so he has these very short, clipped, laconic sentences. He's not going to be persuaded by Fern, he's decided. In this passage, Tom is undecided, and that's really captured by these long sentences that just can't end. I thought that was really clever. Do you see that? Did you feel that? Practice writing this yourself. The effect of writing a really long sentence that just meanders, that just wanders around, it just slows you down. It doesn't conclude. How is the house described when Tom first arrives? Do you remember? Think back to chapter 1. What does Tom feel about the house? Any adjectives come to mind? Empty, cold, and dead. That is how the house is described when Tom first arrives. Now, at the end, after Tom is wrestling with himself, what happens to the house? How is the house described then? Can you remember? What's it doing? There are at least 2 things that the house does. Sighs impatiently and whispers to Tom, "This is your chance." And then says to Tom, "Oh, so you're calling the clock a liar. What's happened to the house? I thought the house was cold and dead. What's happened to it?" It has been personified. It has been given the attributes of a living thing, of a human. It's sighing, it's whispering, it's talking in a cold manner. It's been brought to life. What's the effect of that? cold house suddenly talking to Tom? Well, it changes when the clock strikes 13. So it's got something to do with the striking of the clock, hasn't it? So there is a quality there of magic. Would you agree? What else could there be a quality of? What do you think? The word personification is another one of those words where you can figure out the meaning by looking at the word within the word. So personification. It's simply making something have the attributes of a person. A final question. If you heard a grandfather clock strike 13, would you think you'd miscounted? Or would you think there was magic afoot? Grab a person, pet, or toy and share your thoughts aloud. That's it for today, but I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 10 of our Story Advent Calendar.